The courtroom buzzed with an air of anticipation when Samantha Carter stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the soft click of her heels echoing against the polished floor. She moved with a quiet determination, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room as she made her way to the second row of seats. The gravity of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders, yet her face remained a mask of composure, revealing nothing. At the front, her younger brother, Jason Carter, sat rigidly beside his defense attorney at the defendant's table. His hands were clasped tightly, resting on the table, and his face bore the strain of anxiety. A young black man with closely cropped hair, his weary eyes told a story of too much exposure to the world's unfairness. Seeing him like this tightened Samantha's stomach. Jason had always been the beacon of optimism in their family, convinced that hard work and honesty could pave their way to success. But today, that belief felt buried beneath the oppressive weight of a system that had turned against him. On the judge's bench, Judge Raymond Calloway, an older white man with pronounced features and a permanent frown, hardly acknowledged Samantha's entrance. His robe, intended to represent neutrality, felt more like armor, a stark reminder of the authority he commanded within these walls. The case before them was State vs. Jason Carter, with Jason facing charges of resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. The accusations, weak at best, had been hastily brought forth by a prosecutor eager for an easy win. Jason had simply been on his way home from work when he was stopped by officers claiming he matched the description of a suspect involved in a minor incident at a nearby gas station. When Jason had calmly inquired about the reason for his detention, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The officers accused him of resisting the arrest, and in an instant he found himself on the ground, handcuffed and thrown into the back of a patrol car. Now, in the courtroom, he was grappling for his freedom against charges that were completely unfounded. Samantha took her seat, adjusting the tailored blazer over her navy blue blouse. Her mere presence commanded attention. She had come prepared to make an impact. Alan Denton, the prosecutor, a man with a self-satisfied demeanor dressed in a gray suit, rose and addressed the jury with an air of confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's case revolves around law and order," he stated, pacing deliberately in front of the jury box. He asserted that Jason Carter had been given lawful orders from the officers but chose to disregard them. In that moment, he portrayed Jason's actions as a deliberate choice to resist and obstruct justice. "We are not here to discuss personal opinions or outside narratives. The facts speak for themselves." Samantha's expression tightened in response. The familiar narrative echoed in her mind, one that had been used against countless black men. The implication that compliance could have changed everything. Denton pressed on, enumerating exaggerated claims about Jason's alleged aggressive behavior, framing him as a potentially dangerous individual. Samantha recognized the tone all too well, one meant to create fear and paint Jason as a threat. At the defense table, Jason's lawyer, David Harrington, a middle-aged black man with salt-and-pepper hair, sat with his arms folded, biding his time until Denton concluded his remarks. Then he rose to speak. "Good morning," Harrington began, his voice resonating with assurance. He adjusted his tie before turning his attention to the jury. "Let's focus on the facts. Jason Carter was on his way home from work. He had nothing on him, no weapons, no contraband, and no prior criminal record. Yet, he was stopped by officers who seemed to have made their judgment before he even spoke." Denton shook his head at the situation, but Harrington pressed on, stating, "My client did not resist arrest. He simply asked, 'Why am I being stopped?' and was taken down to the ground for it. Now consider this. If Jason Carter looked different, would we be in this courtroom at all?" The low murmurs that rippled through the room were interrupted by the sharp bang of the judge's gavel. "I expect decorum, Mr. Harrington," Judge Calloway said with an air of indifference. Harrington let out a frustrated breath but nodded in agreement. "Certainly, Your Honor." Samantha watched the judge closely. She had familiarized herself with his past decisions and was aware of his inclination towards harsh sentences for black defendants. His reputation as a stern judge was no secret, but his biases were glaringly obvious. As the first witness took the stand, Officer Mark Townsend, one of the arresting officers, Samantha clasped her hands in her lap. Years of honing her skills. In reading, people had trained her for moments like these, and she sensed the direction this was heading. Townsend, a solidly built man with closely cropped blonde hair, took an oath before settling in. Denton wasted no time and asked, "Officer Townsend, could you explain what transpired that evening?" "Yes," Townsend responded, straightening in his seat. "We were answering a disturbance call from a gas station. The suspect was described as a black male in a dark hoodie and jeans. When we encountered Mr. Carter, he fit that description." Harrington's brow furrowed. "Mr. Carter was dressed in slacks and a button-up shirt. Does that sound like hoodie and jeans to you?" Townsend shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, but in that moment, we had to act quickly." Samantha felt her muscles tighten. That "act quickly" phrase always seemed to translate to acting against black men first and thinking afterwards. "Did Mr. Carter show any signs of aggression?" Harrington pressed on. Townsend hesitated for just a split second. He was uncooperative. Uncooperative in what way? He questioned why he was being stopped. Samantha almost rolled her eyes at the absurdity. Questioning one's own detainment had now been branded as uncooperative behavior under the law. Judge Calloway appeared disinterested in the proceedings, casting only the occasional glance upward. Yet each time Samantha shifted in her chair, he would linger on her for a fraction longer, as if evaluating and judging her silently. She recognized his type all too well. With each testimony that unfolded, the weight of the trial grew heavier. Jason, despite his innocence, sat at the defendant's table as if he had already been condemned in the court's eyes. The subtle smirks from Judge Calloway, Denton's meticulously crafted attacks, and the jury's ambivalent expressions illuminated a harsh truth. This case transcended Jason's predicament. It exposed the broader narrative of how black men were perceived and the judgments they faced even before they could present their defense. What neither Calloway nor anyone else in that room understood was that Samantha Carter was far from an ordinary observer. When the moment arrived, she would ensure they recognized exactly who they were up against. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the prosecution relentlessly targeted Jason Carter's alleged defiance. Alan Denton, relishing the stage, returned to his seat with a self-satisfied smirk, leaving behind a trail of doubt among the jurors. Samantha remained composed, hands resting softly in her lap, but her mind was relentlessly assessing each gesture and word. She had encountered lawyers like Denton before, those who were more interested in their winning records than in justice itself. Meanwhile, Judge Raymond Calloway appeared utterly unconcerned, his gavel perched carelessly between his fingers, as if he couldn't wait to render Jason's conviction, dismissing it as a mere formality. The next witness was summoned. "Officer Stephen Monroe, please take the stand." Another officer involved in Jason's arrest approached, leaner and younger than Townsend, with a fresh-faced demeanor. But Samantha couldn't be deceived. The badge had made him age quickly, and his loyalty was unmistakable. He was here to support his partner, not to deliver an honest account. Once sworn in, Denton jumped right in. "Officer Monroe, can you describe the defendant's behavior during the arrest?" Monroe straightened and nodded affirmatively. "Yes, sir. As soon as we approached Mr. Carter, he became defensive. He raised his voice, questioned our authority, and refused to comply." Samantha felt her jaw tighten. "Lies." "And when you attempted to place him in handcuffs," Denton pressed. "He pulled away, resisting our efforts. At that point, we had no choice but to restrain him." Jason subtly shook his head, but Judge Calloway noticed and frowned. "Defendant will remain silent," he declared sharply. Jason kept his lips tightly pressed together, but Samantha could still see the frustration swirling in his eyes. Harrington rose, fastening his jacket as he made his way to the stand. "Officer Monroe," he began, "you mentioned that my client raised his voice. What did he say exactly?" Monroe blinked. "He asked why he was being detained." "Is that all?" Harrington raised an eyebrow. "He had an aggressive tone," Monroe replied. Harrington offered a thin smile. And what does that mean, exactly? There was a pause as Monroe hesitated. It's the way he said it. He was agitated, Monroe stated, shifting slightly. Harrington nodded thoughtfully. Did he use any profanity? Any threats? Monroe swallowed hard. No, sir. Samantha felt a faint smile creeping in. The inconsistencies were starting to emerge. Harrington pressed on. You said my client pulled away. Did he strike either you or Officer Townsend? No, Monroe admitted. But did he shove you? Harrington continued, pushing further. No, Harrington clarified. So my client never attacked you? He merely questioned the reason for his detention and pulled his arm back when you grabbed him? Monroe shifted again, looking uncomfortable. Yes. The jury watched the exchange closely, some casting fresh glances at Jason. However, Judge Calloway's disapproval was unmistakable. His lips pressed into a tight line as he observed Harrington, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against the bench, already seeming to plot how to put a stop to this line of questioning. Denton quickly interjected. Objection, Your Honor. This is misleading. Sustained, Calloway responded curtly, casting Harrington a warning look. Samantha felt a surge of frustration. Calloway was quickly shutting down arguments that hinted at Jason's innocence. Harrington took his seat, having made a significant point, but Samantha sensed that the momentum wasn't quite shifting. The jury remained uncertain, and Calloway showed no signs of allowing the defense to gain any traction. The next witness was a store clerk from the gas station where the alleged incident took place. Denton called him to the stand, clearly eager to bolster his case. The clerk, a wiry white man appearing somewhat anxious, was sworn in. Denton offered him an encouraging nod before asking, Mr. Darnell, you were working at the gas station the night of the incident, correct? Yes. The clerk nodded eagerly. And you remember seeing the defendant? There was a brief hesitation. Yes, I saw him. Denton moved closer, pressing on. Did you see him involved in any altercation? The man fidgeted, his gaze wavering. Well, not really. There was some arguing outside, but when I looked, I didn't see him fighting. He stepped into the store, and Samantha's gaze sharpened. Denton remained composed, continuing his line of questioning. Did you see the officers? Arrive? He asked. The clerk nodded. Yeah, I saw them pull up outside. Denton smiled, pressing further. Did you hear them giving any commands to the defendant? The clerk shrugged. Not really. They were talking to him, and then it got loud, and they tackled him. Samantha felt a knot form in her stomach. Even the witness wasn't providing the support Denton needed. Harrington seized the moment and stood up quickly. Mr. Darnell, do you recall what Jason Carter was doing before the police approached? The clerk nodded. He was just buying a soda. Some jurors exchanged curious glances. Harrington nodded, slowly. So, just to clarify, my client was inside the store making a purchase, not involved in any altercation when the officers arrived? The clerk hesitated, then replied, Yeah, I guess so. Harrington let the silence hang, letting the weight of his question settle. And yet, despite that, officers tackled him. The tension in the room shifted again. Samantha sensed it. The jury was beginning to notice the contradictions. The attempt to paint Jason as some dangerous criminal when he was simply a man running an errand. Judge Calloway cleared his throat sharply. Let's move this along, Mr. Harrington. Samantha noticed Judge Calloway's fingers drumming impatiently on the bench, frustration simmering beneath his exterior. His goal was clearly to wrap this up with a conviction. Denton jumped to his feet. No further questions. The judge glanced at his watch, letting out a sigh. We'll take a recess before we move forward. As the jury was dismissed and the courtroom cleared, Samantha stayed. Jason turned to her, voice low. Sam, this isn't going well. Samantha locked eyes with him, her determination stealing. I know, but we're not done yet. She directed her gaze toward Judge Calloway, who was rising with a frown. She read the judge's thoughts. Another black man in his courtroom. Just another case to close without a moment's thought. What he didn't see, what none of them perceived, was that Samantha Carter wasn't simply a spectator in the gallery. She possessed power, and she was ready to wield it. As the courtroom resumed, the atmosphere felt different. Samantha could sense it. The scale of the proceedings had tilted, and not in her favor. Judge Raymond Calloway returned to the courtroom, his agitation evident. The patience he had for the defense was waning. Jason Carter sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his squared shoulders hiding the exhaustion that was creeping onto his face. The trial had stretched for hours, and despite the weak spots in the prosecution's case, it was obvious that Judge Calloway was inclined to steer Jason toward a guilty verdict. Alan Denton, the prosecutor, wore a smug expression as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, at this stage the evidence is clear." He was uncooperative. The officers had to resort to force, and we cannot excuse his actions just because he feels remorse now. Samantha had heard enough. She rose, her voice calm but firm. "Objection, Your Honor." Judge Calloway turned his attention to her, seemingly surprised that she was still present. "And who are you to object?" He scoffed. Remaining composed, Samantha replied, "I'm the defendant's sister, and I believe the prosecution is deliberately misconstruing the facts." "Yeah." Calloway leaned back, an arrogant smile playing on his lips. "The defendant's sister. Ah, that explains your little outburst." His gaze swept dismissively over her. "I'm sure you see yourself as a legal expert, but this is no civil rights." Protest. "This is a courtroom, and here you don't get to play the victim." A thick silence enveloped the room. Samantha felt her breath hitch. Did he really just say that? She sensed Jason stiffening beside her. Gasps traveled through the audience. Even Denton fidgeted, realizing that Calloway had overstepped. All eyes in the courtroom were now on Samantha, awaiting her reaction. Instead of responding with anger, she took a deep breath and reached into her blazer pocket. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Without breaking her gaze from Judge Calloway, she produced a small leather case, snapping it open with a quick flick of her wrist. The golden emblem of the United States Secret Service shone brightly under the fluorescent lights. A hush enveloped the courtroom. Judge Calloway's smirk faded. His eyes flitted to the badge, his face paling as the implications sank in. Denton blinked, his jaw working as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Samantha tilted her head slightly, letting the moment take hold before she broke the silence. "Actually, Your Honor, I do know the law." Her tone was crisp and authoritative. "And since you appear to be confused, let me introduce myself properly. Special Agent Samantha Carter, United States Secret Service." The room was thick with tension. Samantha noticed Calloway's fingers twitching on the bench, his breathing noticeably altered. The arrogance and amusement he'd once exuded were gone, replaced by a frantic inner scramble as he tried to grasp the implications of his words. Her voice remained steady as she continued. "As a federal agent, I understand the importance of courtroom, decorum, judicial ethics, and above all, the pervasive biases that threaten the integrity of a fair trial. What you just expressed, Your Honor, wasn't merely inappropriate. It was a clear breach of your oath." Calloway swallowed nervously. He still held the title of judge, but he was acutely aware of the blunder he had just made. Denton, now trying to salvage the situation, forced a chuckle. "Let's not lose our heads here." The judge simply misspoke. Samantha's gaze snapped to him. "Misspoke? No, Mr. Denton. He has shown exactly how he perceives individuals like me, like my brother, and the court has heard it without ambiguity." Calloway tightened his grip on the gavel. He was eager to reclaim authority, but Samantha was tenacious. She stepped forward. "Jason Carter was arrested under false pretenses. The officers acknowledged on the record that he exhibited no violence, no aggression. All he did was inquire about his detention. And still, here we are, with a prosecutor painting him as a criminal alongside a judge who just exposed his bias for everyone to see." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, even some jurors leaning in to whisper among themselves. Samantha turned, back to face Calloway. "Your Honor, you have a responsibility to uphold justice, yet it's evident you entered this courtroom with a preconceived notion." Calloway's face flushed. Was it anger or embarrassment? Samantha couldn't tell. "I will not be lectured here." "Then do your duty, Your Honor," Samantha interjected, her voice cutting sharply through the air. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Calloway's eyes burned with an unreadable intensity, the weight of the room pressing down on him. The jurors' expressions had shifted dramatically. Some appeared shocked, others visibly angry. The court reporter flicked her gaze. Between Calloway and Samantha, her fingers poised above the keys, ready to capture the moment. Denton exhaled heavily, frustration seeping through. He had meticulously woven a false narrative throughout the trial, but now Judge Calloway had inadvertently given the defense a significant advantage. Calloway's jaw locked tight. "We will move forward with closing arguments." His voice had quieted, the fight seemingly drained from him. He understood he was cornered. Any move to steer Jason towards a guilty verdict now would be perceived as vengeance, and all eyes in the courtroom were on them. Samantha nodded, settling back into her seat next to Jason. He glanced at her, his face reflecting a mix of disbelief and admiration. "You really just pulled that off," he whispered. Samantha met his gaze with a subtle, confident smile. "Oh, we're only just beginning." Judge Calloway cleared his throat, adjusting his posture. Yet Samantha noticed the change in the atmosphere. The dynamics had shifted. The room's power was no longer his. It belonged to her. Judge Raymond Calloway sat rigidly, gripping the gavel as if it were his only anchor. The weight of his blunder loomed above him like a dark cloud, the courtroom's silence stretching long enough for Samantha Carter to savor every moment. For the first time since this trial started, Calloway appeared aware of the limitations of his authority. Everyone present, the jury, the onlookers, even the prosecution, had heard his slip. The facade had crumbled, revealing the bias he had tried to mask beneath the supposed impartiality of the law. Samantha didn't need to say another word. The moment had made its impact, but she wasn't finished yet. The court stenographer continued typing, her fingers dancing over the keys as she captured every lingering moment in the aftermath. The damage had been done, and Samantha intended to ensure it resonated. Calloway shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, his voice quieter. "We will proceed with closing arguments." Samantha noted the effort it took him to act as if nothing had transpired. His gaze darted toward the jury as though he were attempting to gauge how much authority he still possessed. But deep down, he knew. They all felt it. Alan Denton stood up, adjusting his suit, but the confidence he'd worn all day had visibly faltered. He remained determined to win, yet Samantha could sense him recalibrating, scrambling to find a way to salvage his case in front of jurors who had just witnessed the judge's slip into prejudice. Denton faced them, taking a breath before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not lose sight of why we're here. At the end of the day, we cannot overlook the fact that the defendant, Jason Carter, resisted arrest. The officers have provided their testimony. The evidence is undeniable. Despite the emotional twists this trial has taken, the law remains the law," Samantha observed as Denton's voice lost its assertive edge. He was desperately trying to regain control, but it was slipping away. He directed his words at Jason. "The police issued lawful orders to Mr. Carter, and he did not comply. If we allow that to go unchecked, we set a dangerous precedent." Samantha's hands clenched into fists in her lap, grappling with the weight of a word that had echoed through history. Disobedience. Denton was speaking in code, aiming to paint Jason not just as a defendant, but as a black man who supposedly overstepped his bounds, someone who needed to be made an example of. Yet the effectiveness of that tactic had faded. Samantha could see the shift in the jurors' expressions. Their conviction was faltering. Denton let out a sigh and forced a smile. "I trust that you will do what is right." With that, he returned to his seat, eyes fixed ahead. Judge Calloway then addressed Jason's defense attorney, David Harrington. "You may proceed with your closing argument." Harrington nodded, rising deliberately, buttoning his jacket as he approached the jury box. His movements were careful and measured. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet but firm strength. "The law is still the law." He paused, allowing that statement to resonate before shaking his head. But what does that truly mean? The law is meant to be fair. The law is meant to protect the innocent. He emphasized the weight of that truth, recalling how it had been manipulated right there in the courtroom. We've witnessed how the law can be twisted, how it can be wielded against people who look like Jason Carter. A murmur of recognition passed through the spectators. Harrington moved to the defendant's table, his hand resting gently on Jason's shoulder. "My client was stopped for no reason. He was questioned without justification, and when he simply asked why, he was tackled to the ground and arrested." He turned to confront Denton directly, his finger pointing emphatically. "The prosecution wants you to see Jason Carter as a threat, some violent figure in need of restraint. But what did you hear today?" He gestured toward the witnesses. "You heard Officer Townsend admit that Jason never attacked him. You heard Officer Monroe confirm that Jason never shoved anyone. And, crucially, you heard their own witness state that Jason wasn't even involved in any altercation. He was simply buying a soda." A pregnant silence filled the room as Denton fidgeted in his seat. Harrington let the weight of that revelation linger. Jason Carter is not a criminal. He is a young man who was unjustly targeted because of his appearance. And if this courtroom is truly a place of justice, there is only one verdict that makes sense. He took a steadying breath, locking eyes with each juror. Not guilty. For the first time throughout the trial, Jason's shoulders finally relaxed. Harrington settled back into his seat as Judge Calloway fidgeted uncomfortably with his robe. The jury was now set to deliberate. With that, the 12 jurors stood and made their exit from the courtroom, but the tension remained palpable, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Samantha could feel it, the lingering impact of the day's events. Quietly, she turned to Jason. "They know the truth now." He exhaled sharply, his fingers drumming anxiously against his knee. "Yeah, but will it actually matter?" Samantha glanced towards the empty judge's bench, where Calloway had retreated to his chambers, clearly rattled by everything that had unfolded. For the first time, uncertainty clouded her belief in his desired outcome. Minutes turned into an hour before the jury finally reappeared. Their expressions were stern, and Judge Calloway returned, his jaw tense as he resumed his seat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman from the front row rose, paper clutched tightly in her hand. "Yes, Your Honor." Calloway swallowed hard and nodded. "Proceed." Taking a steady breath, the woman began to read. "On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant—" The courtroom held its breath. "Not guilty." The words reverberated like a thunderclap. Jason slumped forward, disbelief washing over him. In that moment, a weight that had lingered for far too long lifted from his shoulders. A small smile flickered to life on Samantha's lips. Judge Calloway's face was a mask of barely concealed rage, but he had no option but to accept the verdict. "This court is adjourned." He slammed his gavel down, but it was evident to all that he had already lost. As people began to file out, Samantha turned to Jason, squeezing his shoulder. "This isn't over," she whispered. Jason's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "We won!" Samantha's gaze darted toward Calloway, who was storming out of the courtroom. She understood that this battle had escalated beyond Jason alone. Calloway had shown his true colors, and now the real fight was just beginning. The courtroom buzzed with the aftermath of the shockingly swift verdict. Jason Carter remained at the defense table, breath coming in deep, uneven gulps. Relief washed over him, but the tension in his posture lingered. Samantha, seated beside him, observed the jury's reactions. Some looked pleased with their choice, while others bore contemplative expressions, as if the weight of their decision was finally sinking in. Across the room, Alan Denton's face was impassive, wrestling with the humiliation of a rare public defeat after having cultivated a near-perfect conviction rate. But the most furious presence in the room was Judge Raymond Calloway. His lips formed a tight, pale line, and his knuckles turned white as he clutched his gavel. He glanced at the jury, then shifted his gaze to Samantha and back to Jason. In that moment it was all too clear. If he could reverse the verdict single-handedly, he would. But he was powerless. Calloway's position had unraveled entirely. The jury's decision was final. The courtroom had laid bare his blatant bias. There was nothing left for him to prevent what was about to unfold. "This court is adjourned," he barked, crashing the gavel down with unnecessary force. The sound reverberated through the room, and for a brief moment, no one moved. It felt as though everyone understood the significance of the moment. Then came the whispers. Spectators exchanged murmurs, some reaching for their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Jason slowly turned to Samantha. "I can't believe it," he muttered. "I really thought he would manage to—" "He wanted to," Samantha interjected, her voice unwavering. "But he couldn't." Jason surveyed the room, his eyes darting between the gathering press and the few legal analysts there to watch the proceedings. He let out a sharp breath. "So what happens now?" Samantha's eyes followed Calloway, who had just stepped down from the bench. "Now," she said, "he faces the music. The unraveling has begun." As Jason stood to embrace his lawyer, Samantha shifted her focus to the gallery. Reporters were already furiously jotting down notes, some stepping into the aisle, likely preparing to confront the man who had been caught dishing out racist comments in a courtroom. Calloway seemed to sense the pressure, quickly turning to make a beeline for the exit, thinking he could slip away before the press caught up with him. He was mistaken. "Judge Calloway, can you comment on your remarks today?" A journalist called out. Another stepped forward. "Do you believe your words indicate racial bias from the bench?" Calloway's expression darkened as he raised his hand. No comment. His voice was tight and restrained, but there was a glimmer of something deeper, fear. Cameras captured his every move as he hurried out of the courtroom. Denton, still seated at the prosecutor's table, made no move to defend him. Calloway had become a liability. The case was lost, and Denton needed to create distance before the fallout affected him as well. Samantha took her time gathering her belongings, knowing she didn't need to chase after Calloway. His reckoning was already underway. The backlash had begun. By the time she and Jason stepped outside the courthouse, the media frenzy was already in full swing. Calloway's comments took the media by storm, quickly becoming the talk of the town on social media and in news outlets. Calloway Exposed was trending everywhere. Legal experts started voicing their opinions. Civil rights activists were swift in their condemnation of his statements. Even those who had previously backed his tough sentencing practices found themselves scrambling to distance from him. It wasn't just the courtroom that caught wind of the situation. The Judicial Conduct Board had already issued a statement affirming they were investigating. Samantha couldn't help but smirk. Good. Jason let out a low whistle while scrolling through his phone. "Damn, Sam, they're tearing him apart." "He deserves it," she replied matter-of-factly. He shook his head in disbelief. "I just never thought I'd witness this, a judge actually facing consequences for his words." Samantha turned to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," she cautioned. "Men like him don't just relinquish their power. He's going to fight back." Jason nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "So, what's our move?" Samantha's jaw tightened with determination. "We ensure he doesn't come out on top. The system needs to turn against him." Within 24 hours, Calloway's world began to unravel. The state's Judicial Review Board launched a formal inquiry into his conduct. Old complaints from former defendants resurfaced, highlighting cases where he had rendered shockingly harsh sentences against black defendants. Attorneys who had previously been hesitant began sharing their own experiences. Former clerks admitted to witnessing troubling behavior during their time in his chambers. A disturbing pattern of racial bias came to light, and it was overwhelmingly incriminating. Just 2 days later, the district attorney's office publicly distanced itself from Calloway's comments, and Alan Denton quietly withdrew his involvement in any future cases under Calloway's jurisdiction. Even his judicial peers, once respectful of his authority, started to avoid his name. Then the actual devastation hit. The state governor delivered a public statement. "We cannot allow judges to operate with unchecked bias," he asserted. "Justice must remain impartial, and it's evident that Judge Calloway has failed his duty. I fully support a thorough review of his actions and, if necessary, appropriate consequences." Samantha watched the press conference from her office, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The end was in sight. The final blow landed a week after the trial when Judge Calloway faced the news he had dreaded. The Judicial Conduct Board recommended his suspension while further investigations took place. He fought back, of course. He insisted that his words had been twisted, that the assault on his character was politically motivated. He proclaimed he had never let bias influence his decisions, but the harm was already inflicted. The community had turned its back on him. The legal world had pulled away, seeing him as a risk rather than a protector. And Samantha Carter? She had orchestrated it all. As she settled into her chair, Jason walked in, a grin lighting up his face. "Did you see the news?" he asked. Samantha smirked in response. "I did." Jason sighed, still in disbelief. "I can't believe it's actually happening." "He's really going down." Samantha's smile waned slightly, her tone shifting. "But this isn't just about him. This is about every judge who thinks they can act without consequence, every prosecutor who exploits the law against folks like us, every officer who believes their badge shields them from accountability." Jason nodded. "So what's next?" Samantha leaned back, her eyes shining with resolve. "Now?" She took a deep breath. "We keep pushing." A week after Judge Calloway's suspension, Samantha Carter stood on the courthouse steps, gazing at the throng of reporters, activists, and supporters that had gathered. The news of his fall had reached far beyond their city. It ignited a national dialogue about racial bias in the judicial system. But for Samantha, this was more than just the downfall of one man. It was about a system that had allowed such behavior to persist unchallenged for far too long. Jason stood beside her, hands in pockets, surveying the crowd with disbelief. "This is unreal," he murmured. "I never imagined my case would escalate to something like this." Samantha chuckled softly. Neither did Calloway. Flashes erupted as microphones were thrust in her direction. Reporters clamored over each other, eager for a quote. "Agent Carter, what's your response to Calloway's suspension? Do you think this will lead to broader reforms? What's next?" For Jason Carter? Taking a moment to steady herself, Samantha stepped forward. The crowd hushed, awaiting her words. "This case has never been just about my brother," she declared, her voice firm. "It's about accountability and a system that routinely fails black men and women, criminalizing them for merely existing." Jason listened intently, standing close. Samantha pressed on, her expression resolute. What transpired in that courtroom wasn't a singular event. Judge Calloway's biases came to light because he became too comfortable, too reckless. But how many judges like him are still out there, handing down unjust sentences? How many men like my brother have faced wrongful accusations, suffered mistreatment, and been silenced without a sister in the Secret Service to advocate for them? The crowd's murmurs shifted to a crescendo. Journalists scribbled down notes in a frenzy, realizing that Samantha wasn't merely addressing Calloway. She was igniting something much larger. Jason turned to her, brows slightly knitted in concern. "Sam, what are you doing?" he whispered. Samantha responded with a small, knowing smile before pressing on. "This fight isn't over. It never was. That's why I'm launching an initiative to investigate judicial misconduct, starting with every case that landed in Calloway's courtroom." Gasps echoed through the crowd. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief. Samantha had clearly set her sights much higher than just Calloway. She directed her gaze back to the cameras. Every defendant unjustly sentenced under his rulings deserves a second chance, and for any judge who thinks they can continue to rule with bias, you're next." The crowd erupted. Some cheered while others shouted questions. Reporters hustled. Closer, their voices melding into a frenetic buzz. Jason seized her arm, pulling her slightly away from the microphones. "Are you serious?" he asked, his tone low but urgent. "You're really going after every one of his cases?" Samantha nodded, her resolve unshaken. "It's the only way to ensure he doesn't turn into just another forgotten scandal." Jason hesitated, letting out a deep breath. "Damn," he muttered. "You don't stop, do you?" Samantha flashed, a smirk. "Not when it comes to justice." The movement began to gain momentum. In the weeks that followed, Samantha's initiative flourished. Lawyers, civil rights organizations, and advocates rallied to support her cause. Former defendants, primarily black men and women, unfairly sentenced under Calloway's rulings, came forward, seeking a second chance. The deeper Samantha delved, the graver the revelations became. Calloway had imposed harsh sentences, while white defendants received leniency for similar offenses. His courtroom had been a revolving door of biased rulings against black defendants. It was a disturbing pattern now exposed to public scrutiny. The governor was compelled to take action. In the face of mounting pressure from activists and legal experts, a review panel was formed to investigate Calloway's prior rulings. Some cases were reopened, while others were summarily dismissed. Calloway attempted to retaliate, arguing that he was being unfairly targeted and that his courtroom remarks had been misconstrued. Yet his reputation lay in tatters. He stepped down before they could officially kick him out. Jason was glued to the news in Samantha's living room, shaking his head in disbelief. Who would have thought we'd actually see this day? Samantha filled a glass with water, her thoughts racing. Men like him always believe they're invincible, until reality hits. Jason chuckled, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "And you were the one who made sure he wasn't," she shot back with a shrug. Someone had to take a stand. A new direction emerged. Months slipped by, and Jason's life slowly settled back into a routine, even if he would never be quite the same. He realized just how close he had come to losing everything over nothing significant. But amidst the turmoil, he witnessed the power of resistance. One evening during dinner, he sat across from Samantha, mindlessly stirring his food. "Have you ever thought about making this your full-time gig?" he asked. Samantha looked up, puzzled. "Doing what, exactly?" Jason waved his hand, encompassing the whole picture. "You know, exposing corrupt judges, battling wrongful convictions, the whole deal. You've already got the talent and the network. You practically took down a legal heavyweight in under a month." Samantha laughed lightly. "It wasn't solely my doing." Jason shot her a playful smirk. "True, but without you, I'd probably be locked up." Samantha paused, studying him, then leaned back in her chair. The thought had crossed her mind more than once. The justice system was crying out for reform, real reform, and she'd seen what happens when nobody keeps a watchful eye. "I'm not." "Sure," she finally admitted. "Maybe," Jason replied with a grin. "You'd excel at it." She took a thoughtful sip from her drink. "We'll see." The struggle goes on. A week later, Samantha opened an email with the subject line marked "Urgent." Misconduct allegations against another judge flashed on the screen. Her stomach knotted as she read through the details. Here we go again. Another judge, another case, another life teetering on the edge. She looked at her phone, her own reflection, staring back at her from the dark display. Jason was right. She wasn't just capable. She was destined for this fight. With a steady exhale, she replied, "I'm in. Let's discuss." There was no backing down. Not now. Not ever. And this was merely the beginning.